Picture the scene. The year is 1877, and Britain are a global superpower and have annexed the South African Republic, also known as the Transvaal. The British annexed the area for many reasons, partly because they wanted greater control over southern Africa, and also due to the economic collapse the Transvaal government faced. They also believed that because of this collapse, they were helping the people of the Transvaal and quote-unquote saving them. The Boers, however, were not exactly thrilled about suddenly being absorbed into the British Empire. The way I view it is imagine you sat in your front room, watching your TV, eating some food. Some wealthy person walks in, strutting around like they own the place, without even asking to come in. Even if your house is in ruins, you're still going to ask them to get out. After a few years of British rule, Boer resistance grew. On the 16th of December 1880, the Boers formally rebelled and declared the independence of the South African Republic. The rebellion was led by important Boer leaders, including Piet Joubert, Paul Kruger, and Martinus Pretorius. They are absolutely butchered, but you get the idea. The Boers were mostly descendants of Dutch-speaking settlers and had a strong tradition of independence. Britain had tried to make the Transvaal part of the empire, and the Boers were having none of it. This leads us into the first major event of the war, the Siege of Pretoria, which took place in December 1880. The Boer forces surrounded several British garrisons across the Transvaal, including the garrison at Pretoria, obviously, which was the capital. British troops were left isolated in fortified positions while the Boers controlled much of the surrounding countryside. Other British garrisons included those at Potchefstroom, Lydenburg, and Strandendam. They were also beside or placed under pressure, so Britain technically controlled the Transvaal, but really they didn't because the soldiers were all trapped within a concealed area. The Battle of Bronkhorstspruit, which took place in Bronkhorstspruit, it took place on the 20th of December 1880. A British column under, wait for this name, Lieutenant Colonel Philip Anstruther was stopped by Boer forces and ordered to surrender. Anstruther refused, and the Boers attacked. The British suffered heavy casualties, with around 150 men killed or wounded. It was a major early victory for the Boers, and showed that the rebellion was serious and not something that the British could just ignore or easily swat away. Next came the Battle of Laing's Nek, which took place on the 28th of January 1881. Britain sent a force under, wait for this name, Major General Sir George Pomeroy Colley to relieve the beside garrisons and restore British control. At Laing's Nek, the British attacked Boer positions but were ultimately defeated by forces by Commander Piet Joubert. The Boer made effective use of the terrain and ultimately overpowered the British. The British had the larger empire, but the Boers knew the battlefield, which is a fairly important thing when you're trying to win a war. Following this came the Battle of Schoeningate on the 8th of February 1881. Colley attempted to continue his campaign, however the British suffered another setback at Schoeningate, also known as the Battle of Ingogo. The fighting took place in difficult terrain and poor weather, making the British advance even harder. Although the British were not completely destroyed, they were forced to withdraw. Britain was now facing a series of defeats against a smaller force that was using mobility, local knowledge, and accurate rifle fire to its advantage. What the Brits thought would be an easy win was turning into embarrassment for them. The decisive battle of the war took place at Majuba Hill, in the very originally named Battle of Majuba Hill. It took place on the 27th February 1881. Colley occupied the summit with around 400 British troops, believing that the position would be easy to defend. However, Boer commandos climbed the slopes and attacked the British position. Their superior planning and understanding of the area meant that the British were forced down from the hill. Colley was killed during the battle, and Majuba was a devastating defeat for the British and became the defining moment of the war. It was also a reminder, this is not Star Wars. Actually, having the high ground is useful, but you can't just get on there and have no plan. After the defeat at Majuba Hill, Britain began peace negotiations. The British government had to consider whether continuing the war was worth the cost, particularly when the Boers had already defeated several British forces. The negotiations began only a few weeks after Majuba, showing how serious the British defeat had affected the situation. The war concluded with the Pretoria Convention, signed on 3rd of August 1881. The Transvaal regained self-government, although British retained control over its foreign affairs. In simple terms, Britain had annexed the Transvaal in 1877, fought to maintain control, suffered several defeats, and the Boers gained much of their independence back. The First Boer War ended with a Boer victory, an important example for a smaller force could successfully resist a large empire. You may be wondering, how on earth did the Great British Empire manage to fall to a small colony in the south of Africa? There were multiple reasons for this, such as the racist beliefs of the British that they were the better and superior race to the Boers, leading to a misjudgment of their forces. As well as this, the Boers were actually a very tactically impressive army and used lots of guerrilla warfare tactics. Also, it could be argued that the PM at the time, William Gladstone, who was a liberal, so he opposed, well, not oppose it, but he wasn't for the empire, was very reluctant to the conflict and was against a full-scale invasion. So this limited Britain's forces and the size of the scale of the invasion. However, this was not the end of the story. Almost 2 decades later, tensions between Britain and the Boer republics would explode into an even bigger conflict, the Second Boer War. Britain would return to South Africa, this time with a much larger army and a very different plan.